สัปดาห์ที่แล้วสำนักสันติวิธีและธรรมาภิบาลของสถาบันพระปกเกล้าก็ได้เชิญสมาชิกสภาไอร์แลนด์เหนือมาที่ประเทศไทยนะคะเพื่อมาพูดคุยตรงๆค่ะถึงกระบวนการทำงานในการดึงหลายๆฝ่ายที่เห็นต่างกันมาเข้าสู่โต๊ะเจรจาหารือนะคะดิฉันได้คุยกับ2ท่านหนึ่งในนั้นก็คือคุณอเล็กซ์มัสคีค่ะเป็นสมาชิกสภาไอร์แลนด์เหนือเขตเบลฟาสต์ใต้จากพรรคชินเฟรนเขาบอกตรงๆนะคะว่าเขาเป็นหนึ่งในกลุ่มที่สนับสนุนกลุ่ม IRA หรือว่ากลุ่มติดอาวุธและเข้าใจอุดมการณ์ของพรรค IRA เพราะฉะนั้นการที่มาเข้าสู่กระบวนการเจรจาพูดคุยสันติภาพเป็นเรื่องที่สร้างความเสียใจให้กับกระบวนการอย่างขบวนการ IRA นะคะแต่ก็รู้ว่าจะต้องเกิดขึ้นอีกท่านหนึ่งที่นั่งคุยในวงเดียวกันก็คือคุณแซมมี่ดักลาสค่ะเป็นสสขั้วตรงข้ามเลยนะคะทั้งคู่นี้ถือว่าเป็นศัตรูขับเคี่ยวในการต่อสู้กันตามท้องถนนมาแล้วขณะนี้มาขับเคี่ยวพูดคุยกันต่อแต่เขาระบุว่าเป็นการเปลี่ยนจากการสู้รบในท้องถนนมาเป็นการสู้รบด้วยวาจาซึ่งดีกว่าแน่นอนนะคะเพื่อที่จะทำให้สันติภาพเกิดขึ้นได้อย่างแท้จริงดิฉันมีโอกาสนั่งคุยกับทั้งสองท่านในวงเดียวกันเลยนะคะถึงจุดยืนที่มาและการที่จะเดินหน้าสู่สันติภาพที่ยังเต็มไปด้วยความเปราะบางค่ะเรื่องของสถานการณ์ที่ไอร์แลนด์เหนือจนถึงขณะนี้ถึงแม้จะมีกระบวนการสันติภาพเกิดขึ้นตั้งแต่ปี 1998 แต่ว่าความขัดแย้งที่เกิดขึ้นยาวนานไม่ต่ำกว่า 30 ปีมีผู้เสียชีวิตประมาณ 3,000 คนก็ยังเป็นบทเรียนที่ทั่วโลกกำลังถอดบทเรียนกันนะคะเพื่อที่จะนำไปสู่การปรับปรุงหรือว่านำมาประยุกต์ใช้อย่างเช่นในประเทศไทยค่ะวันนี้แขกรับเชิญท่านแรกคุณอเล็กซ์มาสคีค่ะสมาชิกสภาไอร์แลนด์เหนือเขตเบลฟาสต์ใต้พรรคชินเฟรนอีกท่านนะคะคุณแซมมี่ดักลาสค่ะสมาชิกสภาไอร์แลนด์เหนือเบลฟาสต์ตะวันออกพรรค UDP Democratic Unionist Party เป็นฝ่ายของ Unionist ที่ใหญ่ที่สุดในไอร์แลนด์เหนือค่ะ Thank you both of you for joining me. The troubles happened in 1968 and it went on for 3 decades at least with 3,000 people dead. It must be something in your mind that you just feel that it's time to really sit and talk.
Well, we've had a conflict in Ireland for many decades and many generations have suffered from a conflict in various forms of intensity. By the 1990s, I think all sides in the conflict, the British government, the Irish Republicans, the Unionist communities, realised that we could continue the conflict for another set of decades with no different outcome. In other words, there would be no actual victors. So we decided between ourselves that we had to find a way to end the conflict, reach an accommodation and pursue our political objectives peacefully and democratically. And I think we did that because we all realised that there was going to be no community victorious over another. So we had to reach an accommodation.
Did you have to meet behind the scene before you really coming out and tell the public that you really want to have real negotiation which can lead to reconciliation?
Well, certainly over the years there were various secret conduits or contacts between various stakeholders. And in fact, even when the IRA were involved in the campaign, the British government would have been having secret negotiations and talks, including Margaret Thatcher and others. And so it came to the point where there needed to be channels of communication open, because for us the prize was peace. That for, as you had mentioned earlier on, this violence had gone on for decades. Many of us were war weary, but we were also having children and grandchildren, and we didn't want them to go through the lives that we went through as young men and young women in Northern Ireland. So we set out a stall, we set out to try and achieve peace. And we knew it wasn't going to be easy, but we also needed to recognise that there were victims on both sides. I mean, Alex is a victim. Someone tried to murder him. I'm a victim. Someone tried to murder me as well. And many of us in Northern Ireland have families and friends and associates who have suffered as a result of the conflict. So we don't want to go back to the bad old days. We want a future for our people.
How did you leave that feeling behind that you were once victim before?
It's difficult, and it's still difficult for many people who are victims. My sister was nearly killed in a bomb attack, and she finds it difficult for people like myself sitting down with people from the other community with Sinn Féin, and I understand that, and I can never say that you're wrong. That's where she's at the moment, but other people have made progression in that, and so it's not easy, and it's not easy for any of us, but really for us it has to be cementing a peace process for the long term, that never again that we will hurt one another. And that's one of the things that we learned during this violence, that we could block one another, we could hurt one another, but we couldn't win over one another.
What's the most difficult feeling or difficult aspect that you really need to overcome in order to turn the page from being enemies?
Well, I think first of all, as Sammy has said, there are many victims from our conflict, and I also accept that many of those are unhappy, or in fact some cases very angry or even sad of the peace process and the way in which we now have power sharing government in the north of Ireland, with political enemies now working together as political opponents sharing power. Certainly from my perspective and the people that I would represent, we want to make sure, and we're absolutely committed, that we have no further victims. So the first commitment that we make is that there must be no more victims, and that we have to find a way to accommodate our differences, work together to tackle problems, whether it's disadvantage or lack of education or unequal opportunity. So we have to resolve those problems, and whether our conflict would last for another 10, 20, 30 years, those issues will still have to be addressed at the end of that period. So we want to address them now, at a point where there should be no more victims as part of our conflict.
Can you say that both of you are now friends?
Well, I think so, yes. I think Sammy and myself and many others would have worked very closely together, particularly grassroots. So even before we were in government together, and our two parties actually run the Northern government as we speak. But we would have been working at local level, at community level, working with community organisations, building capacity within community organisations, tackling disadvantage and building good relations. So we have worked, I think, very closely together over a long number of years at a community level, even before we work on an actual political level. And I would say that we're friends by now. Yeah.
What about you, Douglas?
I suppose that if you go back to the conflict, there was a lot of mistrust, a lot of disrespect for one another. And for me, if we've learned anything, it's about when we work together, and I think it's a good opportunity and a good example for what's happening in the southern provinces in Thailand, that when you work with people who you don't even trust, you may not even have respect, but once you work together, and we work together at interfaces to try and reduce violence between two communities over a number of years, you start to gain respect for that person. You start to gain a sense of trust with that person. And it takes time, it doesn't happen overnight, but at least that I know, if I ring Alec up about a situation, well, I know that if he gives me his word, that he would hold to that. And that's an important part of any relationship.
And you said political leadership is really important to bring forward peace process. It involved even during the time of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But why it came through during Prime Minister Tony Blair? What's the turning point?
Well, I would say that during those contexts behind the scenes, that there were messages given out by the actors, the players in the situation, from the British government, from Sinn Féin, from the IRA, from the Unionist Protestant community, to say, look, we're willing to sit down and try and reach an agreement. And I think once people start to take the initiative, and I think Alex has said earlier on, it wasn't just at the highest level. Very often it was people at a local level talking to one another and getting the feeling, well, look, maybe we could try something new here. And that fed into the whole political process, and it got to the stage where we wanted to sit down because we wanted, Northern Ireland to be at peace with itself.
Should the beginning come from the local community first?
Well, I think as Sammy says, our peace process evolved, if you like, very often at a local level in civic society terms. Some individuals, whether they were members of the religious organisations or community organisations, very often people were working together at local level to sort local problems out. Of course, the main players, the main organisations and governments have to make the final decisions and the major decisions, but they would be supported by people at grassroots level who want a better way forward, who want an end to conflict and political instability. Our peace process evolved to the point where when Tony Blair was elected as Prime Minister of Britain in 1997, his predecessor John Major didn't have a majority in the Westminster Parliament, and therefore whilst he had engaged with the Republicans, he wasn't able to bring that to a successful conclusion. But fortunately we also had a simultaneous parallel contact with the Irish government, with members of Sammy's broader community. So we had the good fortune that we had people like Tony Blair, the Irish Taoiseach at the time, Albert Reynolds, and even President Bill Clinton elected in the US, people who were willing to take risks. They were political leaders over and above others perhaps who were prepared at government level to actually take political risks to go for the prize of peace, as Sammy outlines it as. So we were fortunate that there was a lot of work at ground level to underpin the prospects for a peace process, which the major players of course had to develop formally.
This time have you visited the south of Thailand, deep south of Thailand?
No, we haven't yet. I mean, in the last number of years we have spoken to some people from the south of Thailand area. We're very sensitive to the concept of sovereignty of the Thailand people and the Thailand government, so therefore we are very conscious that our role is not one of imposing ourselves on people in Thailand. We only have our own experience of our peace process to offer anyone in this country who wants to listen.
And I suppose what I would say is that during our own peace process, as Alex has outlined, we needed help and support and guidance, and he's mentioned a number of those people, including President Bill Clinton and George Mitchell, his envoy. But it would have been difficult, and I would have found it quite hard to accept. You know, people just come in and start to talk to whoever they wanted, and that's not what we're here for. We're also here to learn as well. And it's sad that I was on the internet and reading about coming to Thailand, and it said that Bangkok's okay, but just watch the southern counties or provinces as such. So hopefully, I mean, this is a beautiful country, and I would personally love to go and visit the southern provinces at some stage, just as a visitor, as a tourist.
The revolution in 1998, what's the difference now? Has it very much improved the situation after this political decision to have devolution?
Well, certainly we have come a long way, and as I said earlier on, Northern Ireland isn't the place it was 20, 30 years ago. Last year we had the G8 conference, all the world's leaders. Now they went to Northern Ireland because A, they wanted to go, but B, it was secure, and that they realised that Northern Ireland is moving ahead. At a political level, we have difficulties. I was the first to admit that. There's an impasse at the moment, but we've been here before. I mean, the early assembly collapsed, and then we just sit around the table and renegotiate, and we're back in government with Sinn Féin. But it's like every political process and peace process, that there's always humps and bumps in the road. And as I said at the KPI seminar earlier on, that I remember talking to some of our colleagues from South Africa. I was saying, this is 8 years ago, 9 years ago, we've come to an impasse. It's going to collapse, everything's going to go belly up. And then he said, look, we were in the same situation. Times when we felt the South African peace process, it's going to collapse. Bumps in the road, we'll never get over them. but you eventually get over them. And we've been through much worse, and we've come to a point now that I think we're starting to mature as a community, because don't forget, for decades we had direct rule from England, from Westminster government, so we didn't have the experience of actually ruling ourselves.
What have carry on the negotiation process, the peace process? Because I guess it must be a very fragile process when you move along.
So first of all, I mean, we're all political activists, and therefore we have our own political objectives. For me and my party, our work has to be about delivering on the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, as you know, reach and accommodate across a wide range of issues, from the Constitution to policing and justice to building a society based on equality and protection of human rights. All of those are fine words, but in order to implement that and to make it a reality, that's where there's a challenge. And so therefore we have found implementing the agreement and aspects of the agreement is where the difficulties lie. We have a process at the moment which is in some political difficulty. We have to resolve that, because we are determined to make sure we have no return to the conflict in the past.
And what's the situation of IRA at the moment? Are they really disarmed?
The IRA is disarmed, its organisation. The IRA, as we say, has gone. And that's something that I am very proud about, because I come from that background, I come from that historical background. But I am very proud as an Irish Republican that our generation of Republicans are able to say we have left that part of our history behind.
But Jerry Adam, the case still being pursued in the court of what he did with IRA. Will this bring up anger or hatred among people in Northern Ireland? Will the same old feeling comes back?
Well, this has been a very controversial issue, and of course you will understand that very many people have a different interpretation of all of that. From my point, and Gerry Adams is my party leader, he's a personal friend of mine, and I believe that Gerry Adams has been singled out by people who are opposed to the peace process. That's my belief. Others don't accept that. That's my belief. But at the same time, when Gerry Adams was released from being questioned, Gerry Adams was the first person to say we need to put this in the past, we need to work together, we need to resolve our conflict, and we need to resolve all of the issues of the conflict, including what happened in the past.
With the Deep South situation in Thailand, right now the government has imposed emergency decree, emergency law. Do you think it's appropriate? Should this be pursued on, or what's the aspect that the government or military should be concerned of?
Well, certainly we had emergency laws during our conflict, and for many years it was very, very difficult. The reality was that the majority of people wanted those laws. There was major violence, there was uncertainty about people going out to do shopping and maybe a shotgun bombed, or people been murdered. But some of those laws actually increased the problem. One would have been internment, when people were arrested initially from IRA Republican backgrounds and put in prison without going through the whole judicial position. And consequently there were some people, a smaller number of unionists and loyalists. But those type of measures tend to, I believe, they encourage recruitment among young people in particular, who feel disenfranchised, feel that they've been picked on. So for me, there comes a time when if you really want to make peace, you need to have a sense of justice, sense of human rights as part of the whole overall package. But I can understand when governments do take those actions, because very often the communities are calling for that because they want that sense of security.
Our problem we identified as a political problem. So the military solutions, whether it was the armed campaign or whether it was the British, if you like, military apparatus and judicial activity, repressive measures, none of that worked. And our view was that we have a political problem which requires a political solution. In our circumstances, that meant that we had to find a way to end the IRA campaign and the activities of other paramilitary organisations. We also had to have the British to demilitarise their weaponry and their fortresses and their troops. So some of that came before the Good Friday Agreement. So, for example, we had the IRA and Loyalist ceasefires in 1994. We had British troops then started to come off the streets, out of the communities. After the Good Friday Agreement, the IRA and other organisations disarmed their organisations. British demilitarised, took away their forts, sold many of the land then back to the community for community development. So there was a process of taking weapons out of use, demilitarising the situation and bringing about change to the policing and justice environment, which was policing a civic society or civic policing rather than policing as a paramilitary force. So for us the lesson had to be that we had to remove the violence, but the violence is in many forms. The violence also includes injustice, and you need to remove all of that.
I assume that from Unionist Party perspective, you have gained much more economic advantage and social advantage over people from IRA or opposing camps. What do you think you have to release power in order to enter negotiation?
Yes, well part of the agreement was that we would actually sit down and share power, which was a new thing for all of us. And again, this was in the context of a bitter war in a sense, where thousands were killed. The IRA killed over 2,000 people, Loyalist Unionists killed over 1,000 people. So it was that context, and as I mentioned earlier on, it also the likes of victims as well, people who didn't want, an agreement between the IRA or Sinn Féin and the DUP and the Loyalist paramilitaries as well. So that was a very difficult situation. But for us, the prize was that there would be initiatives that would help the Unionist cause. And one of those things was that the Irish government had a claim on Northern Ireland for many years. It was called Articles 2 and 3. So as part of that, they removed that. But the biggest prize was that the IRA gave up the balance, and the Loyalists consequently gave up the balance as well. And that was the thing that we were able to share power. We were able to give power across the table because we were all benefiting from it.
You said the most important thing is justice from the whole process. Do you mean amnesty to every party involved?
Well, my party's never called for amnesty. I make the point that people talk about peace. But peace is not just the absence of violence, because in our circumstances we had injustice on a number of levels throughout our society, and for me that's violence in another form. So, in order to remove, in my opinion, to secure peace, you have to secure a just peace. In other words, you have to have equality, human rights protection for every citizen. The question of amnesty, we have never sought an amnesty, but certainly in the Good Friday Agreement, we had an early release programme for prisoners, for example, if they were members of an organisation which was involved in the ceasefire and involved in the peace process. So we had several hundreds of political prisoners released as part of the Good Friday Agreement. And the vast majority of those prisoners support the peace process very much so, and continue working today to support that agreement. So we're not asking for an amnesty. What we do believe is that there should really be a process of truth and reconciliation. In other words, conscious of the many victims, most of whom have never had any justice, and most of whom are not likely to get justice in terms of having someone convicted for the attack or killing of their loved one, that at the very minimum there needs to be a truth process which would allow families who have lost someone in the conflict to at least know why or how it happened or why it happened and so on. There are many others in our community who are victims who want to see people prosecuted and go to prison, want to see people like myself and others excluded from the political process. None of that's going to happen. So we need to have a process which we are currently trying to negotiate our way through. So Sammy's party, my own party and others are trying to reach an accommodation on how we address the legacy of our conflict. That's a difficult one. That's one we could not agree on Good Friday, and we still need to deal that out because that's what's one of the causes of our current impasse.
What about you? How do you think justice can happen?
Well, certainly my own party would have always portrayed itself as a law and order party, and they would have opposed the release of prisoners. And I wasn't a member of the party in those days. In fact, I supported the release of prisoners because I feel the prisoners, ex-prisoners, political prisoners, they had a major role in helping to initiate the peace process, but to make sure it actually happened as such and the violence stopped. Yes, we certainly believe in justice, and I suppose with Alex and myself, we would be very much diametrically opposed to one another in terms of the constitutional question. But when it comes to social justice, economic justice for people, job creation, particularly in jobs and education for disadvantaged communities, we would have very similar political views in that sense. So yes, we certainly believe in justice.
How fragile of the Irish peace process at the moment, because you said you still need to work on the details of Good Friday Agreement. How fragile of the whole process?
Well, I think that we need a balance because we do have more or less a political impasse at the moment. I think our political institutions are perhaps in danger of maybe collapsing. That may happen.
Really?
It may not. I don't think the peace process, I don't think a return to conflict or a return to violence is likely anytime soon. But at the same time, I would caution that we need to build. Peace processes are not easy. Conflict is sustainable. Peace processes need more work, and therefore I do believe that we need to be very careful that we don't underestimate the difficulties that the institutions being collapsed could cause for all of us.
And I suppose that if I look at Northern Ireland in terms of the population, it would be similar to the Deep South. I think we have about 1.8 million people. Deep South would have about 2 million. And we had over 3,500 people killed as a result of the Troubles. Thousands injured. Many of those people are still about. So for them, they see us in the Assembly, that appears not to be working. We fight, we argue on television, and that's very often what they see. So I think Alex is right. The institution may collapse. And I think one of the difficulties is it's the nature of the structures that we have. And it was necessary at the time where we had all the parties together in coalition government. But the problem at this point in time is that obviously there's a lot of hurt and anger, even among the parties. People are traumatised, including politicians. So we don't get on. We would argue, and one of the problems is that Alex's party can block us, we can block them, we can stop things happening. And unfortunately that is what has happened. But that structure came from an agreement at St Andrews. Maybe we need another type of St Andrews to sit down and say, well, that was important for the time, for such a time as this. Maybe we need new structures. I believe we do need new structures, because one of the things we don't have at this point in time is, unlike any other democracy that I know, we don't have an opposition. We have a government, but we have no opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kasky and Mr. Douglas for joining. Thank you very much. ทั้งสองท่านย้ำนะคะว่ากระบวนการสันติภาพจะต้องเดินหน้าและปรับเปลี่ยนไปตามสถานการณ์ไม่มีอะไรตายตัวและจะประมาทไม่ได้ค่ะต้องอาศัยความร่วมมือจากทุกฝ่ายเพื่อที่จะเอาชนะอุปสรรคร่วมกันค่ะ